But first, with Victoria's total corona deaths today getting to 800 lives lost, don't we owe it to them and to their families to get to the bottom of what went wrong? It's simply not good enough to accept at face value that no one made the decision to use private security for hotel quarantine rather than the combination of police and military personnel that were used in every other state and where no catastrophic failures took place. The line out of the Commission that there's now this creeping assumption that it should have been private security, and that's what it ended up being, but that the decision didn't come from any individual person, but somehow adopted everywhere, is simply too self-serving to be true. Let's look again at the sworn testimony of the then Police Commissioner Graham Ashton, the person whom we know never wanted to have Victoria Police babysitting people in hotels because they already had too much to do. Ashton told the inquiry that he first learnt of the National Cabinet decision to put all the returning travellers into hotel quarantine at about 1 p.m. on Friday the 27th of March, just about the time that the National Committee meeting broke up.
And as I understand it, this seems to have been sent at 16 minutes past 1 on the Friday afternoon, the 27th of March.
Yes.
Why did you send this message?
Well, at that time I had learned, I believe, from Reece Kershaw that there was a plan to isolate overseas travellers within the hotels in enforced isolation, I should say, in hotels.
Now, at that point, in around 1 o'clock when the National Cabinet meeting broke up, he said he thought that running quarantine would be a federal responsibility.
Well, at that stage, I believe that, I didn't really know what was happening in regards to the whole thing. I believe that these people would still be, at that point in time, I believe these people would still be the subject of Commonwealth responsibility.
But he must have very quickly learnt that it was to be a state responsibility, because at 12 minutes past 1, he texted the Australian Federal Police Commissioner Reece Kershaw saying this: "Mate, question, why wouldn't AFP guard people at the hotel?" Well, before a response could come back from the AFP chief in Canberra, at 1:16, Ashton sent a text to the head of the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, Mr Chris Eccles, saying this: "The suggestion is that Victorian arrivals are conveyed to a hotel somewhere where they are guarded by police for 14 days. Are you aware of anything in this regard?" This is the text from Graham Ashton to Chris Eccles, all detailed in the witness statement. Now, there was no response to this text, but Ashton must have learned something, because over the next 6 minutes, he learned it obviously clearly in that time, that critical 6-minute period, because at 22 minutes past 1, Ashton sent a further text back to Federal Police Chief Kershaw in Canberra with this fairly dramatic message. He said, "Mate, my advice is that ADF will do the passenger transfer and private security will be used." 22 minutes between the Victorian Chief Commissioner of Police not knowing how hotel quarantine will operate, to then confirming it will be defence on passenger movements, which we know now never happened, and the very fateful choice of private security guards for everything, not Victoria Police. All of that in 22 minutes. Now, at 1:31 p.m, the AFP's Reece Kershaw responds back to Graham Ashton with this: "OK," he says, "that's new." And then at 1:32, Ashton tells Kershaw, "I think that's the deal set up by our DPC." And that's the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria. Now, it's telling that Eccles' initial statement to the inquiry said nothing about his 1:16 text message from Ashton. It was only after Ashton's written statement detailed the existence of this text message from Ashton to Eccles that Eccles lodged a supplementary statement in evidence to the inquiry where he said he doesn't recall getting the text at 1:16. He doesn't recall whether he actually spoke to Ashton at this time. And he says that no such decision to use private security had been made by me or anyone to whom I had spoken. But a decision had been made because at a media conference at about 3:15 that afternoon, the Premier got to his feet and he said, and I quote, "Police, private security, all of our health team," he said, "would be used."
I mean, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping?
Yeah, we'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force. I think people will do the right thing. I think people know and understand this is serious, and they're coming home because they know that this is the safest place to be. They're coming home because they know that we are taking this seriously and the National Cabinet is working in the national interest.
Now, in his testimony to the inquiry, Ashton insisted he couldn't remember where he got the advice from, the advice about private security in that critical 22-minute period between not knowing to the AFP and suddenly telling the AFP how it would work. He can't recall where he got that advice. The decision he didn't know about, then found out about, then sent around, as I said, all in the space of those mere minutes. Now, conveniently, the phone records tendered to the inquiry are not the full phone records. They are the billing records, the sort of phone bills you and I might get about all the information of the calls we make, but not the calls we receive. Indeed, when asked specifically about this, Ashton conceded that incoming calls, other than those from some senior police phones, were not recorded. If this was a full judicial inquiry, which it is not, or a royal commission, a warrant process could be used to subpoena the full phone records, both the outgoing phone records, which we have, which show that text message from Ashton to Eccles, but critically, any incoming responses from people to Ashton, which we don't have. Now ask yourself this: who in the Victorian system of government would be able to decide in the 6 minutes between the text to the Premier's department head asking essentially what the hell is going on, and Ashton's text then to the AFP Commissioner making it clear that Victoria Police would not be running hotel quarantine and that it's instead, very unusually, it would be private security in Victoria? Who's important enough, do you think, to make that sort of decision in 6 minutes flat? There's no prize for concluding it must have been the man at the top or someone very close to that man. Here's what I know that happens in times like this, from my experience in Canberra. If the federal government that I had served in had needed to stand up a new operation like this, something as big as hotel quarantine, immediately after the close of the relevant cabinet meeting, in this case a national cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister, the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the PM's Chief of Staff, possibly a few others, they would have all gone into a room to work out who was doing what. On receipt of the Ashton text to Eccles, why wouldn't someone in the equivalent Victorian government room have spoken to Ashton to give him the assurance he sought that it would be private security, not Victoria Police, doing hotel quarantine? We might assume that happened, of course. I probably assume it happened. But we can't confirm what happened because none of us were in the room and because we do not have access to any incoming calls, if there were calls, to Graham Ashton in that critical 6 minute period. But certainly someone very senior told him what he wanted to hear, that private security would be used to make him confident enough to pass that information on to Kershaw, and in my judgment, only a message from the top would do that. That's why the phone records that this inquiry can't get, because it lacks the powers, are so important. Especially in the light of the former Health Minister's statement on the weekend that there are elements in the Premier's testimony to the inquiry that, I quote, she said, "I strongly disagree with." The inquiry has a duty, surely, doesn't it, among everything else, to recall the Premier and to further put these questions to the Premier and the Premier's Chief of Staff. Because between the close of National Cabinet at around 1 p.m, when police and ADF were to run hotel quarantine, and the Premier's statement at about 3:15, his press conference, where he announced that it would be private security, somewhere between all of that, the Premier, the Police Minister, perhaps his Chief Public Servant, perhaps his Chief of Staff, perhaps indeed the Police Commissioner, who spoke to whom about what? It's simply not credible that no one remembers. What's needed is a full disclosure now of all phone records between these individuals. Mobile phones, landlines, outgoing and incoming. I have a theory, I reckon I'm right, but the phone records will help tell Victorians the truth over what's now been a loss today of 800 lives.